The humid Shreveport air hung heavy, even inside Mabel's kitchen. Naomi patted her forehead with a damp paper towel, the fluorescent lights of the staff bathroom casting a sickly yellow glow on her reflection. Her break was over, and the greasy smell of frying bacon, usually a comfort, now only amplified the gnawing unease in her stomach. The AC in her beat-up Corolla had finally given up the ghost, and the repair bill loomed like a storm cloud over her already precarious finances. Each rotation of the rusty ceiling fan seemed to mock her worries, pushing around the same stale air. She closed her eyes, picturing the crumpled eviction notice tucked in her purse. Another month. Just one more month, she silently pleaded. She splashed cool water on her face, the momentary chill a small reprieve from the suffocating heat. Back at the counter, the usual Tuesday afternoon lull had settled. Chef Reggie, a mountain of a man with a surprisingly gentle demeanor, gave her a sympathetic nod. "Rough day, eh?" he mumbled, flipping a burger with practiced ease. She managed a weak smile. "Just the usual, Reggie." The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. As if summoned by her unspoken anxieties, three men entered the diner. They moved with an air of quiet authority, their tailored suits and polished shoes a stark contrast to the faded vinyl booths and checkered linoleum floor. Wealth radiated from them like heat from furnace. Naomi's stomach twisted, the kind of men who could probably buy and sell Mabel's 10 times over without blinking an eye. She forced a professional smile, grabbing menus and approaching their table. "Afternoon, gentlemen. Can I get you something to drink?" The oldest of the three, a man with steel-gray hair and eyes that seemed to hold a lifetime of secrets, studied her for a moment longer than felt comfortable. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face, a fleeting expression she couldn't quite decipher. His gaze shifted to the menu, but Naomi's eyes were drawn to his hand resting on the table. A small, irregularly shaped birthmark, like a splash of port wine, stained the skin between his thumb and forefinger. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Her breath hitched in her throat. It was identical, a mirror image of the birthmark her father had carried, a mark she'd traced with her tiny fingertip as a child, listening to his fantastical stories of pirates and buried treasure. A mark that lived only in faded photographs and fractured memories. A mark that became a symbol of the gaping hole his absence had left in her life. A tidal wave of emotions crashed over her: confusion, disbelief, a wild, desperate hope she hadn't realized she'd been harboring. "Hi, sir," she blurted out, the words escaping before she could stop them. Her voice trembled slightly, her professional facade crumbling under the weight of the sudden revelation. The two younger men at the table looked up, startled by her tone. The oldest man, however, remained impassive, his gaze fixed on the menu. Naomi swallowed, gathering her courage. "My father, he had the same birthmark." The silence that followed stretched taut, thick with unspoken questions and simmering tension. The younger of the two accompanying men, all sharp angles and impatient energy, shifted in his seat. He opened his mouth to speak, but the older man, his expression finally registering a flicker of surprise, raised a hand to silence him. He slowly lifted his gaze, his eyes, the same shade of gray as the Louisiana sky before a storm, locking onto hers. Naomi's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. His scrutiny felt like an X-ray, piercing through her carefully constructed defenses, exposing the raw vulnerability beneath. The silence continued, each tick of the clock amplifying the tension. Naomi fought the urge to fidget, her hands clenching and unclenching beneath the cheap polyester of her uniform. Her mind raced, a whirlwind of fragmented thoughts and memories. Could it be? Could this man, this stranger radiating power and wealth, be the father who had abandoned her and her mother years ago? The thought felt both absurd and terrifyingly possible. Finally, the older man spoke, his voice low and controlled. "Is that so?" The words were non-committal, yet Naomi felt a tremor of something beneath the surface, a carefully masked emotion she couldn't quite place. The older of his companions, a man with a calmer, more pragmatic air, leaned forward. "William," he said softly, his voice laced with caution. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately." The man called William, her possible father, dismissed the suggestion with a curt wave of his hand. "It's fine, Jeff." He turned his attention back to Naomi, his gaze unwavering. "Tell me about your father." The request hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Naomi hesitated, her mind a jumble of conflicting thoughts. She wanted to demand answers, to unleash the years of pent-up anger and resentment. But something in his eyes, a flicker of vulnerability beneath the carefully constructed facade, held her back. "His name was Daniel Ellis," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. The words felt strange and foreign, as if she were speaking of a character in a half-forgotten dream. He left when I was young." She trailed off, unable to articulate the complex emotions that swirled within her. William listened intently, his expression unreadable. The diner, once bustling with the lunchtime rush, now seemed eerily quiet, the clatter of plates and the murmur of conversations fading into the background. Even Reggie, usually a constant source of background noise, stood silently at the grill, his eyes fixed on the unfolding drama. "And his birthmark," William prompted gently, his voice a subtle blend of curiosity and something else, something that sounded almost like apprehension. "Was it exactly like mine?" Naomi nodded, her throat constricting. "Yes," she managed, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Exactly." A long silence followed. William's gaze drifted away, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the greasy windows of Mabel's. He seemed lost in thought, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Finally, he sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of years. "I believe a DNA test is in order." The words hung in the air, heavy with the promise of a future neither of them could have predicted. Naomi's mind reeled, struggling to process the sudden turn of events. A DNA test, a confirmation, a father. The pieces of her fragmented past seemed to be swirling together, forming a new, terrifyingly complex picture. She looked at William, this stranger who might hold the key to her identity, and felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. Jeff, ever the pragmatist, smoothly intervened. "I'll arrange everything, William." Discreetly, of course. He handed Naomi a business card, his expression carefully neutral. "Please call me tomorrow. We'll set up an appointment." Naomi took the card, her fingers trembling slightly. She looked at the name embossed on the crisp, white paper, Jeffrey Harrington, Ashford Enterprises. Ashford Enterprises. The name resonated with power and influence, a stark contrast to her own precarious existence. William stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked at Naomi, his eyes holding a complex mixture of emotions: curiosity, uncertainty, and perhaps a hint of regret. "Thank you," he said, his voice low and husky, "for bringing this to my attention." He turned and walked out of the diner, followed by his two companions. The bell above the door chimed softly, signaling their departure and leaving Naomi standing there, numb with shock, the business card clutched tightly in her hand. The greasy smell of frying bacon suddenly became overwhelming. The clatter of plates and the murmur of conversations seemed to amplify the silence in her own mind. She turned to Reggie, her eyes wide and unfocused. "Reggie," she whispered, her voice trembling. I think I just met my father." Reggie, his face etched with concern, reached across the counter and gently squeezed her hand. "It's going to be all right, Nay," he said softly. "Whatever happens, it's going to be all right." But even as he spoke, Naomi knew, with a chilling certainty, that nothing would ever be the same again. The clatter of cutlery against plates, the sizzle of bacon on the grill, the low hum of conversation, the usual symphony of Mabel's kitchen faded into a distorted buzz in Naomi's ears. The three men at table 5, their faces now masks of varying degrees of shock, seemed frozen in time. The coffee pot in her hand trembled, a faint metallic clang against the ceramic mugs. Had she really said it? The question reverberated in her mind, a frantic hummingbird trapped against the bars of a gilded cage. She'd seen that birthmark 1,000 times in her dreams, a dark crimson stain against her father's calloused hand, a phantom limb of memory, always just out of reach. Now, here it was, stark and real, marring the smooth, aged skin of the man across from her. Regret, sharp and cold, pricked at her, but it was too late. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. The two younger men, their expensive suits suddenly ill-fitting in the down-home atmosphere of Mabel's, exchanged uneasy glances. The one she'd pegged as Mason shifted in his seat, his gaze darting between her and the older man, a flicker of suspicion in his eyes. Jeff, the more composed of the two, remained silent, a subtle tension tightening the corners of his mouth. He seemed to be calculating, weighing the potential damage of this unexpected revelation. But it was the older man, William Ashford, who held her captive. His expression, though carefully controlled, betrayed a flicker of something unreadable surprise, disbelief. His eyes, the color of aged whiskey, held a depth that both intrigued and intimidated her. A lifetime of power and control radiated from him, a silent force that pressed against the confines of the small diner. Naomi's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence that stretched between them. This man, with his impeccably tailored suit and the air of quiet authority, couldn't possibly be cold. The silence, thick and suffocating, was finally broken. His voice, a low rumble, cut through the ambient noise. "What did you say?" The four words, simple yet weighted, seemed to echo in the suddenly hushed diner. Even Chef Reggie, usually oblivious to the dramas unfolding in the front of house, paused his frantic flipping of pancakes and glanced over, his brow furrowed in concern. Naomi swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. The smell of frying bacon, usually comforting, now churned in her stomach, a nauseating wave of anxiety. Every instinct screamed at her to retract, to apologize, to disappear back into the anonymity of her waitress uniform. But something held her rooted to the spot, a strange compulsion to see this through, to finally grasp the phantom limb of her past. "My father," she repeated, her voice barely a whisper, each word a fragile shard of glass. He had that same mark on his hand. As the words left her lips, a strange calm descended. The frantic hummingbird in her chest stilled. She'd said it. It was out there. And now, she had to face the consequences. William Ashford's gaze, intense and unwavering, locked onto hers. The faint lines around his eyes deepened, etched by years of untold stories, years that Naomi suddenly felt a desperate need to understand. The air around them crackled with an unspoken tension, a silent conversation conducted in the shared space of their mutual shock. Mason, clearly agitated, cleared his throat. "Mr. Ashford, I think this young lady is mistaken. Perhaps we should—" William raised a hand, silencing his associate without even looking at him. His focus remained fixed on Naomi, as if trying to decipher a complex equation written in her eyes. He took a slow, deliberate breath, the subtle rise and fall of his chest the only outward sign of his inner turmoil. The silence stretched again, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of the old clock above the counter. Naomi watched him, her own thoughts a chaotic whirlwind. What was he thinking? Did he remember? Could he possibly have any inkling of the connection that had just been so unexpectedly, so clumsily revealed? Jeff, ever the pragmatist, leaned forward, his voice low and measured. "Mr. Ashford, perhaps we can discuss this in private?" William finally broke his gaze, glancing at Jeff before returning his attention to Naomi. A subtle shift in his posture, a barely perceptible relaxing of his shoulders, suggested a decision had been made. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small, sleek device. A DNA testing kit. Naomi's breath hitched. This was real. This was happening. The mundane reality of Mabel's kitchen, with its checkered tablecloths and the lingering scent of coffee, seemed to dissolve around her, replaced by a dizzying sense of unreality. "Would you be willing?" he asked, his voice still low, but now laced with a note of something that sounded almost hopeful. Naomi hesitated. 1,000 questions swirled in her mind. What if it was true? What if this powerful, enigmatic man was really her father? What would that mean for her life, her future? Fear warred with a strange, nascent sense of anticipation. She glanced at Chef Reggie, who gave her a small, encouraging nod. He'd always believed her stories about her father, the stories that had been dismissed by so many others as the fanciful imaginings of a lonely child. Taking a deep breath, she nodded. Yes, she said, her voice trembling slightly, I would. The process was quick and sterile. The clinical detachment of the DNA hid a stark contrast to the emotional maelstrom raging within her. As she watched William swab the inside of his cheek, the same spot she had just swabbed herself, a strange sense of surrealism washed over her. This simple act, so mundane in its execution, held the potential to rewrite her entire life story. The implications were staggering, terrifying, and exhilarating all at once. The silence that followed was charged with anticipation. The small device whirred softly, processing their genetic codes, holding the key to a past that had haunted Naomi for so long. The minutes ticked by, each one stretching into an eternity. Finally, a small green light flickered on the device. William looked at the result, his expression unreadable. He then met Naomi's gaze, his eyes now filled with a complex mixture of emotions she couldn't quite decipher. It seems, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, we have some things to discuss. A flicker of a smile, almost imperceptible, played at the corners of his mouth. Naomi, wasn't it? The use of her name, spoken by this man, in this context, sent a shiver down her spine. It was a confirmation, a validation of a truth she had always known deep down in the hidden recesses of her heart. The world around her seemed to shift, to realign itself around this newfound reality. The clatter of Mabel's kitchen faded back into focus, but it was different now, overlaid with the weight of this revelation. The future stretched before her, a vast, unknown landscape, shrouded in both uncertainty and the tantalizing promise of answers. The clatter of dishes and the sizzle of grease were a familiar cacophony, usually a comfort to Naomi, a predictable rhythm in her chaotic life. But today, the sounds grated on her nerves, each clang a hammer blow against the fragile wall she'd erected around her composure. She'd fled to the relative sanctuary of Mabel's kitchen, the swinging door a temporary shield against the unsettling presence at table 6. The scent of frying onions, usually so appetizing, choked her. The heat from the stove, normally a welcome warmth, felt oppressive, mirroring the burning anxiety in her chest. Her hands trembled as she wiped down the already spotless counter, her movements mechanical, her mind a whirlwind. That birthmark, it couldn't be a coincidence. The same distinctive shape, the same placement on the back of his hand, just below the knuckle of his thumb. Just like her father's. The memory, usually a hazy, painful blur, now sharpened a vivid snapshot of a hand holding hers, a hand with that mark. A hand she hadn't seen in years. A hand attached to a man she barely remembered. But his eyes, those she remembered. The same steely gray, the same unnerving intensity that had just pierced her across the diner floor. You good, Naomi? Chef Reggie's voice, gruff but laced with concern, cut through her swirling thoughts. He loomed beside her, a mountain of a man in his stained apron, his brow furrowed. Yeah, she managed, the word a thin, reedy sound betraying the lie. Her smile felt brittle, plastered on her face like a cheap mask. He knows I'm lying, she thought, but he's letting me pretend. She appreciated that, the unspoken understanding between them, the shared burden of hard lives and harder truths. That table of suits still ain't ordered. What did you do? Scare him off with your dazzling personality? He chuckled, but his eyes remained watchful, searching her face. If only you knew, she thought. If only you knew how close you are to the truth. The thought of confessing, of sharing this burden, however, felt impossibly heavy. She couldn't articulate the confusion, the fear, the sudden, irrational hope that flickered like a fragile candle flame in the howling wind of her uncertainty. Just taking my time, she replied, forcing a lighter tone into her voice. They seemed preoccupied. The understatement of a century, she thought bitterly. Preoccupied with her, she suspected. With the ghost of a past they thought they'd buried. Reggie grunted, seemingly satisfied with her non-answer. He turned back to the grill, the sizzle of burgers a temporary distraction from the turmoil raging inside her. Naomi's gaze drifted back towards table 6. The three men were still there, engaged in a low, hushed conversation. William Ashford, the man with the birthmark, sat stiffly, his back ramrod straight, his face an impassive mask. His younger colleague, the impatient one, gestured animatedly, his words too low for her to hear, but his frustration palpable even from across the room. The older man, the calmer one, seemed to be mediating, his hand resting on William's arm in a gesture that seemed both reassuring and controlling. Naomi watched them, a strange cocktail of emotions churning within her. Fear, certainly. This man, this William Ashford, radiated power, wealth, a world she could barely comprehend. But there was also a flicker of something else, something akin to recognition, a sense of belonging she hadn't felt since her mother died, leaving her adrift in a world that felt both hostile and indifferent. She thought of the worn photograph she kept tucked away in her wallet, the only picture she had of her father. A faded image of a young man with kind eyes and a hesitant smile. Could this imposing, austere man be the same person? Could the years, the accumulation of wealth and power, have transformed him so completely? The questions whirled around her, each one sharper, more insistent than the last. What did he want? Why hadn't he looked for her before? Was he even aware of her existence? And the most terrifying question of all, did she even want him to be her father? The fantasy she'd clung to for years, the dream of a loving father who would swoop in and rescue her from her precarious existence, now felt childish, naive. This man, this stranger, was not the hero of her imagined narratives. She gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles white. The diner's familiar noises faded into the background, replaced by the roaring in her ears, the frantic beat of her heart. She needed air. She needed space. She needed to escape the suffocating weight of this sudden, unexpected revelation. Without a word, she pushed through the swinging door, ignoring Reggie's questioning grunt. She stumbled towards the back exit, the cool night air a welcome slap against her heated skin. Leaning against the brick wall, she closed her eyes, trying to slow the frantic race of her thoughts. The image of the birthmark, seared into her memory, refused to fade. It was a brand, a mark of belonging, a link to a past she had never known, a future she couldn't comprehend. And in that moment, standing in the alley behind Mabel's kitchen, Naomi knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that her life would never be the same. The clatter of plates and the sizzle of the grill formed a chaotic symphony around Naomi as she forced a smile, notepad in hand. Her heart pounded against her ribs, a trapped bird desperate for escape. Returning to table 5 felt like walking a tightrope over a chasm of uncertainty. She'd replayed the encounter in her mind 100 times in the last few minutes, each replay ending with a different, equally improbable conclusion. Could this man, this William Ashford, really be connected to her father? The resemblance of the birthmark was uncanny, an unsettling echo of a past shrouded in mystery. She steadied her breath, reminding herself to maintain her professional composure. Tips were crucial, especially today. Even more so now, with this strange, unsettling development. "Can I take your order, gentlemen?" Her voice wavered slightly, betraying the tremor in her hands. The younger man, Mason, opened his mouth to speak, but William held up a hand, silencing him with a subtle gesture. His eyes, the color of aged whiskey, held an unnerving intensity as they met Naomi's. "We need a minute before we order." His voice was a low rumble, commanding yet laced with an odd hesitation. Naomi's grip tightened on her notepad. A minute? What would they possibly need a minute for? The thought echoed her own frantic internal debate. She wanted to flee, to hide in the bustling chaos of the kitchen, but something kept her rooted to the spot. A morbid curiosity, a sliver of desperate hope. Mason shifted impatiently in his seat, glancing at his watch. The older colleague, Jeff, offered a placating look. The air crackled with unspoken tension. The aroma of frying onions and burnt coffee seemed to thicken, suffocating her. Naomi swallowed, the lump in her throat refusing to budge. She forced another smile, a brittle, artificial thing. "Certainly. I'll be back in a few minutes." Turning away, she felt their gazes burning into her back, heavy with unspoken questions. Back in the relative sanctuary of the kitchen, Reggie, the chef, noticed her pale face. "Everything all right, Naomi? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Something like that," she mumbled, leaning against the cool steel of the counter. She couldn't bring herself to share the details. Not yet. It felt too fragile, too unreal. "Just some difficult customers," Reggie grunted, flipping a burger with practiced ease. "Rich folks. Always trouble." Naomi managed a weak smile. Reggie's words, normally a source of shared commiseration, offered little comfort now. Her father, if this man was indeed connected to him, had been anything but rich. A struggling musician, a ghost in her own life. The disparity made the situation even more surreal. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Each tick of the clock amplified the disquiet in her stomach. Finally, she forced herself to return to table 5. This time, William looked directly at her, his expression unreadable. "My name," he began, his voice low and deliberate, each word hanging in the air like a suspended note, "is Clinton R. Ellis." The name hit Naomi like a physical blow. The blood drained from her face, leaving her lightheaded. Clinton R. Ellis. Her father's name. A name she hadn't spoken aloud in years. A name etched onto a tombstone she'd never visited. Her mind raced, trying to reconcile the impeccably dressed man before her with the faded photographs of her father, a man of laughter and music, a man forever young in her memory. "Clinton Ellis?" she echoed, her voice barely a whisper. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. This couldn't be happening. It was a cruel joke, a cosmic coincidence of the worst kind. "Yes," William confirmed, his gaze unwavering. "And you're Naomi?" She nodded, unable to speak. The diner's noise faded into a distant hum. All that remained was the man across from her, her father's name on his lips, and the unsettling resemblance of that birthmark. "I knew a Clinton Ellis," she finally managed, her voice trembling. He was a musician, a pathetically inadequate description of the man who had haunted her dreams, a melody forever unfinished. A flicker of something recognition, pain, crossed William's face. It vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a carefully constructed mask of neutrality. "He was more than that," he said, his voice tight. He paused, as if choosing his words with meticulous care. "Did he ever mention me?" Naomi shook her head slowly. Her father had never spoken of family, of any life before he'd met her mother. His past with a locked door, and she'd never possessed the key. He called himself Clint, she whispered, the words escaping her lips before she could stop them. Clint Ellis. It was a name only her mother and he had used, a private language of love and loss. The silence that followed was deafening. William's carefully constructed composure seemed to crack, revealing a glimpse of the turmoil beneath. His eyes, those aged whiskey eyes, widened slightly, a flicker of vulnerability breaking through the stoic facade. "Clint," he repeated, the name a ghost on his tongue. He closed his eyes for a moment, a long, shuddering breath escaping his lips. When he opened them again, they were filled with a strange, unsettling mixture of emotions she couldn't decipher. Regret? Longing? Fear? Jeff cleared his throat, breaking the spell. "Perhaps we could discuss this somewhere more private," he suggested, his voice smooth and diplomatic. William ignored him, his gaze fixed on Naomi. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, sleek device, a DNA testing kit. The gesture was so unexpected, so abrupt, that Naomi gasped. "I don't understand," she stammered, her mind reeling. "This will tell us everything we need to know," William said, his voice regaining its usual steeliness. He extended the kit towards her. "Will you do it?" Naomi stared at the kit, her hand hovering over it. A lifetime of questions, of unanswered prayers, condensed into this small, sterile package. The weight of it felt immense, crushing. The diner's noise, previously a distant hum, rushed back in, assaulting her senses. The clatter of plates, the murmur of conversations, the sizzle of the grill, all of it seemed to amplify the chaotic symphony in her mind. She looked at William, at the man who might be her father, at the stranger who bore her father's name, his birthmark, and perhaps a piece of her own fragmented identity. Taking a deep breath, she reached out and took the kit. Her fingers brushed against his, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt of electricity through her arm. "Yes," she said, her voice barely audible above the din, "I'll do it." The unspoken promise hung in the air, heavy with the weight of a shared, unknown past, and the terrifying prospect of a future forever altered. The greasy scent of frying onions clung to Naomi's skin, a stark contrast to the crisp, expensive cologne that still lingered in the air from the man's presence. Back in the chaotic heat of Mabel's kitchen, she leaned against the cool metal of the prep table, phone clutched in her hand. Her fingers hovered over the screen, composing a text to her mother. The words formed slowly, each one a hesitant step into a territory she hadn't dared to explore for years. "Mom, I saw a man today. He looks like how I imagined Dad might have looked. Older, of course, but the same eyes. And a birthmark, Mom, just like Dad's, on his left hand." She stared at the message, a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. Send? Don't send? What if her mother didn't answer? What if she did and confirmed her worst fears, or worse, dismissed them entirely? Naomi hit send. The small swoosh sound the phone made felt disproportionately loud in the sudden quiet that descended on her little corner of the kitchen. The clatter of pans, the sizzle of the grill, Chef Reggie's booming laughter all seemed to fade as she waited, each second stretching into an eternity. Naomi glanced at the order tickets piling up, a familiar pang of guilt hitting her. She should be working, focusing on the endless stream of hungry customers, not lost in a whirlwind of what-ifs and maybes. But her hands wouldn't obey. They remained glued to the phone, her gaze fixed on the small, empty screen. It was a mirror reflecting her own emptiness, the hollow ache in her chest that had been a constant companion since her father's death. He'd been a phantom in her life, a whispered name, a collection of faded photographs and half-remembered stories. Her mother had always been tight-lipped, deflecting any questions about him with a strained smile and a change of subject. Naomi had learned to stop asking, but the unanswered questions had festered, growing into a deep-seated resentment. Now, this man, William Ashford, with his expensive suit and unsettlingly familiar eyes, had ripped open old wounds, exposing the raw nerve of her past. "Everything all right, Naomi?" Chef Reggie's voice, a comforting rumble, broke through her thoughts. She looked up, startled, and saw him standing beside her, a concerned frown creasing his brow. "You look like you've seen a ghost." His words hit a little too close to home. Naomi forced a weak smile. "Just tired, Reggie." She tried to sound convincing, but her voice trembled slightly. Reggie raised an eyebrow, unconvinced. "Tired? Or troubled? You've been glued to that phone for 10 minutes. He gestured to the overflowing order tickets. "Fry cook's getting antsy." "Right," Naomi mumbled, shoving the phone into her apron pocket. She grabbed a handful of tickets, her mind still racing. What if William Ashford really was her father? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. It was absurd, impossible. Yet the birthmark, it couldn't be a coincidence. Could it? She tried to focus on the orders: a cheeseburger, fries, onion rings, a BLT, but the words swam before her eyes, blurring into a meaningless jumble. Her father's face, or rather, the face she had constructed in her mind over the years, superimposed itself onto every customer who walked through the door. Each time the bell above the entrance chimed, her heart skipped a beat. She imagined William Ashford returning, demanding answers, or worse, denying everything. The phone vibrated in her pocket, and she snatched it out, her breath catching in her throat. It was just a notification from the diner's scheduling app. A wave of disappointment washed over her, so potent it left her knees weak. She leaned against the counter, trying to steady herself. Why was she so fixated on this? Why did this man's existence suddenly hold so much weight? She barely knew him. He was a stranger, a wealthy stranger who probably wouldn't even remember her name by tomorrow. But the thought of him leaving, disappearing back into his world of privilege and power, leaving her with nothing but unanswered questions, filled her with a sense of panic she couldn't explain. She typed another message to her mother, shorter this time, more desperate. "Mom, please answer. It's important." The waiting was agonizing. Every minute that ticked by felt like a deliberate taunt, a confirmation of her fears. Maybe her mother didn't want to know. Maybe she already knew. Maybe she had been keeping this secret from her all these years. The thought stung, a betrayal that cut deeper than any she could have imagined. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, her phone buzzed. Her hand trembled as she reached for it, her heart pounding against her ribs. It was her mother. A single word. "Ooh." Naomi's fingers flew across the screen, fueled by a sudden surge of adrenaline. "William Ashford. Real estate. He has a birthmark on his left hand. Just like Dad." She sent the message, then held her breath, waiting for the response. This time, the wait wasn't as long. Her mother replied with a chillingly brief message. "Get a DNA test." The coldness of the message sent a shiver down Naomi's spine. It was a confirmation and a command, all in one. The world around her seemed to tilt, the clatter of the kitchen fading into a distant hum. This was it, the moment of truth. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that nothing would ever be the same again. The chipped Formica tabletop of Table 5 held the remnants of a power lunch, untouched salads, half-eaten steaks, and the lingering aroma of expensive cologne. Mason tapped his foot restlessly, the rhythmic thud a counterpoint to the clatter of dishes from the kitchen. His gaze darted between the impassive William Ashford and the back door, where Naomi had disappeared 10 minutes prior. "Mr. Ashford, are you sure about this?" The situation could become messy, especially with the press sniffing around the Shreveport development deal. William, seemingly oblivious to Mason's agitation, traced the rim of his coffee cup with a finger, the peculiar birthmark on his hand a stark contrast against the white porcelain. He hadn't felt this unsettled in decades. The diner, a world away from his usual polished boardrooms, thrummed with a raw energy that both intrigued and disturbed him. He could almost taste the irony finding a potential daughter in a greasy spoon in Shreveport, Louisiana, a past he'd meticulously buried, now unearthed by a chance encounter and a shared mark of flesh and blood. Jeff, ever the pragmatist, cleared his throat. "Mason's right, William. We need to contain this quickly. A DNA test is a sensible precaution, but this whole affair needs to be handled discreetly." "Patience, gentlemen." William finally spoke, his voice low and controlled. He felt a strange pull towards this unknown girl, a flicker of something akin to recognition in her eyes. He'd built an empire on calculated risks, but this felt different. It was personal. The air crackled with unspoken tension. Meanwhile, behind the swinging doors of Mabel's kitchen, Naomi leaned against the cool brick wall, her phone clutched in her hand. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the backdrop of sizzling bacon and the rhythmic chop of Chef Reggie's knife. She dialed her mother's number with trembling fingers, the question burning on her tongue, a question she'd never dared to ask. The phone rang 3 times before a familiar, weary voice answered. "Naomi? Is everything all right?" Naomi swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. "Mom, I need to ask you something. Something important." The clatter of the kitchen faded into the background as Naomi focused on her mother's breathing on the other end of the line. "What is it, honey?" Naomi hesitated, the words catching in her throat. "Dodo, you know a man named William Ashford?" A silence stretched across the line, thick and heavy. Naomi could hear her mother's sharp intake of breath, a sound that spoke volumes. The grease-stained tiles beneath her feet felt suddenly cold. A knot formed in her stomach, a premonition of the truth she was about to hear. "Naomi," her mother's voice was barely a whisper, laced with a tremor Naomi had rarely heard. Why would you ask about him? The unspoken question hung in the air, a fragile thread connecting them across the miles. Naomi's grip tightened on the phone. He is a birthmark on his hand, the same as the one Dad had. The word Dad felt foreign on her tongue, a ghostly echo of a man she barely remembered. Another silence, even more pregnant with meaning than the last. The kitchen noises seemed to amplify the quiet, each clang of a pan, each sizzle of grease, a sharp punctuation mark in the unspoken narrative. Finally, her mother spoke, her voice low and strained. Before you were born, Naomi, we were in Baton Rouge. For a short time, the words hit Naomi like a physical blow. Baton Rouge, William Ashford. The pieces clicked into place, forming a picture she hadn't dared to imagine. Her carefully constructed world, her assumptions about her past, crumbled around her. The diner, the smell of frying food, the concerned look on Chef Reggie's face, all faded into the background. Hee-hees, Naomi struggled to articulate the words, the reality too overwhelming. Yes, Naomi, her mother's voice was choked with emotion. It's possible. It's possible he's your father. Naomi closed her eyes, the truth settling upon her like a heavy shroud. A lifetime of unanswered questions, of vague hints, and carefully avoided conversations suddenly made sense. The financial struggles, the constant feeling of being adrift, the unanswered questions about her father's identity, it all pointed back to this moment, to this phone call, to this revelation. She opened her eyes, the fluorescent lights of the kitchen seeming harsher than before. Chef Reggie stood a few feet away, his brow furrowed with concern. He opened his mouth to speak, but Naomi shook her head, cutting him off. She needed a moment to process, to absorb the seismic shift in her reality. She took a deep breath, the stale air of the kitchen doing little to clear the fog in her mind. Mom, she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. I need to talk to him. Back at table 5, the silence was broken only by the clinking of ice in William's glass. He watched the back door, his gaze fixed on the point where Naomi had disappeared. He felt a strange mix of anticipation and dread, a feeling he hadn't experienced since his early days building his empire. The door swung open, and Naomi reappeared. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed, but her expression held a new resolve, a steeliness he recognized in himself. She walked towards the table, her steps measured and deliberate. The diner, the other patrons, the concerned glances of his colleagues all faded into the background. The only thing that mattered was the young woman standing before him, the young woman who held a piece of his past, a piece of his future in her hands. The air thickened with unspoken words, with the weight of a shared history, with the promise of a complicated future. The DNA test would confirm the biological link, but the real test, the test of character and connection, had just begun. The humid Shreveport air hung heavy, thick with the scent of frying onions and exhaust fumes. Naomi watched the 3 men climb into the sleek black SUV, its tinted windows obscuring the occupants like a dark secret. A tremor, not quite fear, not quite excitement, vibrated through her. Her hand instinctively went to her apron pocket, clutching the crumpled napkin with William Ashford's name scrawled on it. It felt unreal, like a fragment of a dream she couldn't quite grasp. Chef Reggie's voice cut through the haze of her thoughts. Girl, you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. Naomi forced a smile. Just tired, Reggie. Tired didn't even begin to cover it. It was a bone-deep weariness, a weariness of the spirit, a weight she'd carried since her mother's evasive answers about her father had trailed off into silence years ago. The SUV's engine purred, a low growl that echoed the unease in Naomi's stomach. She watched it pull away from the curb, disappearing into the late afternoon traffic. Inside, the air conditioning battled the Louisiana heat, creating a cool, sterile environment that starkly contrasted with the simmering emotions within. You have to be careful, Bill. Mason's voice was tight with concern. He glanced at William in the rearview mirror, his reflection a mask of controlled anxiety. He'd seen that look before, the one that preceded swift, decisive action, the kind that made headlines and shifted fortunes. This was different. This was personal. This was unsettling. Mason shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the leather sticking to his skin. The silence in the car was thick, punctuated only by the hum of the engine and the rhythmic tap of William's finger against the leather armrest. A rhythm that spoke of a mind working overtime, calculating, assessing. "Bill, if there's even a small chance that girl is yours," Jeff's voice was low, laced with a cautious pragmatism. He met William's gaze in the rearview mirror. Years of working alongside the real estate magnate had taught him to read the subtle shifts in his expression, the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw, the flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. This wasn't just about business. This was about legacy, about the carefully constructed narrative of William Ashford's life, a narrative that, until this moment, had excluded any mention of a daughter waiting tables in a Shreveport diner. William stared out the window, the passing cityscape a blur of color and motion. He barely registered Jeff's words. His mind was a tempest, a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. Disbelief warred with a strange, nascent flicker of something. Could it be hope? He dismissed the thought almost as quickly as it formed. Hope was a dangerous indulgence, a luxury he couldn't afford. He'd built his empire on pragmatism, on cold, hard logic. Sentimentality had no place in his world. Yet, the image of the girl, Naomi, her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and defiance, was burned into his memory. The birthmark. God, the birthmark. Identical to the one his own father had borne, a small, irregularly shaped mark on the back of his hand, just below the thumb. A genetic marker passed down through generations. A marker he thought had ended with him. He closed his eyes, inhaling deeply, trying to regain control. This was absurd. A coincidence. It had to be. He'd dealt with countless claims over the years, people seeking a piece of his fortune, grasping at straws, weaving elaborate lies. This was just another one. More sophisticated, perhaps, but ultimately, just another attempt to exploit his wealth. But the doubt, like a persistent weed, refused to be eradicated. What if? The question echoed in the silence of his mind, a whisper against the storm. What if against all odds this girl, this Naomi, was his daughter? The implications were staggering, a seismic shift in the carefully constructed landscape of his life. He opened his eyes, his gaze sharp, focused. "Pull over," he commanded, his voice low, steady. Mason glanced at him in the rearview mirror, surprised. "Sir," I said, "pull over." There was an edge to his voice, a steeliness that brooked no argument. Mason complied, guiding the SUV to the side of the road. He looked at William, waiting for an explanation, but none was forthcoming. The silence in the car was heavy, pregnant with unspoken questions. William reached for his phone, his fingers moving with a precision that belied the turmoil within. He dialed a number, his gaze fixed on the passing traffic, his mind already racing ahead, strategizing, planning. He needed confirmation. He needed proof. One way or another, he would get to the bottom of this. He owed it to himself, and perhaps, he realized with a sudden, unsettling jolt, he owed it to her. Back at Mabel's, Naomi busied herself clearing tables, her mind still reeling. Reggie watched her, concern etched on his kind face. "You sure you're all right, Naomi?" he asked again, his voice gentle. Naomi managed a weak smile. "Just a lot on my mind, Reggie." She picked up a tray, her hands trembling slightly. The diner's familiar clatter, the sizzle of the grill, the murmur of conversations, usually a comforting backdrop to her day, now felt jarring, intrusive. She wanted to escape the noise, the questions in Reggie's eyes, the weight of the unknown that had suddenly descended upon her. The image of William Ashford's face, etched with a strange mixture of surprise and something else she couldn't quite decipher, kept flashing in her mind. The way he'd looked at her, the intensity of his gaze, it was unsettling, unnerving. It felt significant. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. She needed to think, to process everything that had happened. The birthmark, the name. The possibility. It was too much too fast. She felt adrift, lost in a sea of uncertainty. A sudden, inexplicable urge to run, to disappear, washed over her. But where could she run? From what? From the possibility of a truth she'd spent her life searching for? From the potential upheaval of a life she'd known, a life of struggle and uncertainty? She closed her eyes, the weight of it all threatening to suffocate her. Little did she know, the wheels were already in motion, the gears of fate turning, drawing her inexorably toward a future she couldn't yet comprehend, a future inextricably linked to the man who had just driven away in the black SUV, the man who might, just might, be her father. The muted glow of the phone screen painted Naomi's face in an eerie light. The message was short, stark, almost clinical. If you want the truth, I'm willing to talk. Beneath it, a picture of a business card. William Ashford, CEO, Ashford Developments. The name echoed the hushed whispers she'd overheard at Mabel's kitchen, the awe in Reggie's voice when he'd pointed out the man. A knot tightened in her stomach. Was this some cruel joke? Some bizarre power play from a man who enjoyed toying with people's lives? She ran a hand through her tangled hair, the cheap dye scratching her scalp. What truth? What was there to talk about? Her father was dead, buried in a pauper's grave, a ghost that haunted her waking hours and whispered in her dreams. But the birthmark, God, that birthmark! It couldn't be a coincidence. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, each tap a hesitant step into the unknown. Where? When? She finally typed, the brevity of her message reflecting the tight coil of anxiety in her chest. A reply pinged almost immediately. Beehive Diner. Tomorrow, 8 a.m. The Beehive. It was a place that catered to Shreveport's elite, a stark contrast to the greasy spoon where she slung hash browns and lukewarm coffee. Unease prickled her skin. What was she stepping into? The fluorescent lights of Mabel's buzzed overhead, the sizzle of bacon a constant soundtrack to her apprehension. Reggie, bless his soul, noticed her distracted air. "Penny for your thoughts, Naomi?" he asked, sliding a plate of perfectly cooked eggs onto the counter. "Just thinking," she murmured, picking at a stray thread on her apron. Thinking about a life that might have been. Thinking about a man who might be her father. The thought felt alien, ludicrous, yet a sliver of desperate hope, thin as a razor's edge, flickered within her. Sleep was a fickle friend that night. Images of her father, blurry and indistinct, mingled with the sharp, imposing figure of William Ashford. She tossed and turned, the cheap mattress springs groaning beneath her. Doubt gnawed at her. This was madness. It had to be, but what if it wasn't? The Beehive Diner hummed with quiet conversation, the clinking of silverware a delicate counterpoint to the low murmur of voices. Naomi sat stiffly in a booth, her worn denim jacket a stark contrast to the plush velvet seating. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the sweet scent of pastries, but she couldn't bring herself to eat. Every nerve ending tingled with anticipation and a strange, unfamiliar fear. He was late. 5 minutes. 10. Maybe he wouldn't come. Maybe this was all a cruel game. A surge of anger, hot and sharp, shot through her. Then she saw him. William Ashford. He moved with an air of quiet authority, his tailored suit and crisp white shirt a world away from the grease-stained aprons and worn-out jeans of Mabel's. He sat down opposite her, his gaze steady, unwavering. "Ms. Ellis," he acknowledged, his voice low and measured. "Mr. Ashford," she replied, her own voice trembling slightly. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken questions, with years of lost time. He began to speak, his words carefully chosen, each syllable measured. He spoke of a brief affair, a woman he'd barely known, a life he'd left behind. He spoke of regret, of a past that had come back to haunt him. Naomi listened, her skepticism a shield against the rising tide of emotion. It was a well-rehearsed story, she thought, a practiced performance. But his eyes, there was something in his eyes, a flicker of vulnerability, a hint of pain that belied the polished facade. "I know this is a lot to take in," he said, his voice softer now, almost hesitant. but I believe you might be my daughter." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Naomi's mind raced. It was too much, too fast. She needed proof. Tangible, irrefutable proof. "I don't know what to say," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. Her carefully constructed wall of disbelief began to crumble, replaced by a swirling vortex of confusion and a strange, aching longing. "I understand your skepticism," he said, his gaze holding hers. "I wouldn't expect you to believe me based solely on my word. I'm prepared to offer you proof. A DNA test." The words hit her like a physical blow. A DNA test. It was the only way to know for sure, to finally silence the whispers of doubt that had plagued her for so long. "All right," she agreed, her voice barely audible. The word felt heavy, laden with the weight of a lifetime of unanswered questions. A flicker of something that might have been relief crossed his face. He reached into his pocket and produced a small, sealed envelope. "Here are the details," he said, sliding it across the table. "A reputable lab. Completely confidential." Naomi picked up the envelope, her fingers tracing the smooth, cool paper. It felt strangely heavy, like a key to a door she had been afraid to open. A door that led to a past she had never known, a future she couldn't imagine. He rose to leave, his movements as precise and controlled as ever. "I'll be in touch," he said, his voice betraying a hint of awkwardness, of uncertainty. She watched him go, the scent of his expensive cologne lingering in the air. She sat there for a long time, the untouched coffee growing cold in her cup, the envelope clutched tightly in her hand. The hum of the diner faded into the background, replaced by the deafening roar of her own thoughts. A DNA test. It was a simple procedure, a scientific certainty. But the results could change everything. Fear and hope warred within her, two powerful forces vying for dominance. The future stretched before her, a vast and unknown landscape. And for the first time in a long time, Naomi felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years, a glimmer of anticipation. The sterile white walls of the DNA testing center seemed to amplify the nervous hum in Naomi's ears. The cotton swab felt strangely invasive against the inside of her cheek, a small act with potentially life-altering consequences. William Ashford, a man she'd served greasy spoon breakfast to just days before, stood across the room, an impassive statue in a tailored suit. He looked utterly detached, as if this entire procedure was a minor inconvenience, a business transaction rather than a potential reunion with a daughter he never knew existed. Naomi swallowed, a knot of anxiety tightening in her throat. What if it's not him? What if this whole thing is a mistake, a cruel trick of fate? She glanced at William again, searching his face for any flicker of what? Hope? Fear? She found nothing but a carefully constructed mask of neutrality. The technician's voice cut through the silence, explaining the process, the timeline, the confidentiality. Naomi barely registered the words. Her mind was a whirlwind of fragmented memories, her mother's evasive answers about her father, the worn photograph tucked away in her childhood keepsake box, a man's face obscured by shadows. Back in her cramped apartment, the silence was deafening. The peeling paint on the walls, the overflowing laundry basket, the chipped mug on the kitchen counter, all the familiar imperfections of her life suddenly felt magnified, stark reminders of the precarious balance she maintained. 2 days. 2 days until she knew. 2 days suspended in a strange limbo, caught between the mundane reality of her daily struggles and the dizzying possibility of a drastically altered future. She scrubbed at a stubborn grease stain on the stovetop, the rhythmic motion a futile attempt to scrub away the uncertainty that gnawed at her. Each ring of her phone sent a jolt of adrenaline through her, each notification a potential harbinger of life-altering news. She found herself staring at the photograph again, the shadowed man's eyes seeming to bore into hers, asking questions she couldn't answer. The email arrived at 3:17 a.m. Naomi was at the all-night gas station on the edge of Bossier City, picking up a shift for a sick coworker. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow on the empty aisles. The chime of the email notification on her phone felt disproportionately loud in the stillness. Her hand trembled as she tapped the screen. "Your DNA results are ready." 6 words that held the weight of a lifetime. She clicked the link, her breath catching in her throat. The page loaded slowly, each pixelated image a torturous delay. Then, the words appeared, stark and undeniable against the white background. 99.98% probability, biological parent match, William Ashford. The linoleum floor seemed to sway beneath her feet. The air thickened, making it hard to breathe. "He's my father." The thought echoed in her mind, a strange mixture of disbelief and a peculiar sense of relief. Closure? She wasn't sure. All she knew was that the world had shifted on its axis. In the opulent silence of his hotel suite, William stared out at the glittering Shreveport skyline. The city lights blurred through the rain-streaked window, mirroring the confusion that swirled within him. Jeff, his older colleague, sat across the room, a silent presence in the dimly lit space. "So," Jeff finally asked, his voice low and cautious. William turned, the faint glow of his phone illuminating the stark lines of his face. "It's a match," he said, the words flat, devoid of any inflection. He handed the phone to Jeff, who scanned the results, his eyebrows rising slightly. "Well," Jeff said, exhaling slowly, "this changes things." William didn't respond. He walked to the window again, the city lights now a kaleidoscope of meaningless colors. He'd built his empire on calculated risks, on strategic moves, and unwavering control. But this was uncharted territory. A daughter, a life he hadn't known existed, suddenly thrust into his meticulously ordered world. He felt a strange tightening in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in years' vulnerability. Naomi. He tested the name on his tongue, a name that now held a weight, a significance he couldn't yet comprehend. He thought of her face, the weariness in her eyes, the quiet dignity she carried despite the evident hardship of her life. "My daughter." The words resonated with a strange power, a mixture of guilt, curiosity, and a flicker of something akin to hope. Mason, his younger colleague, entered the room, his usual impatience radiating off him. "Anything?" he asked, his voice laced with a hint of annoyance. "It's confirmed," Williams said, turning to face him, his expression unreadable. "She's my daughter." Mason's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed in suspicion. "Are you sure this isn't some kind of scam?" he asked, his voice laced with skepticism. Jeff intervened before William could respond. "It's legitimate, Mason," he said firmly. "We've taken all the necessary precautions." Mason opened his mouth to argue, but William silenced him with a raised hand. "Enough," he said, his voice low but firm. "This is a private matter. I'll handle it." He turned back to the window, the city lights now a distant, insignificant blur. He had a daughter, and everything had changed. The plush carpet swallowed the sound of her heels. Each click, muffled and indistinct, seemed to mock the pounding in her chest. Naomi clutched the thick envelope tighter, the crisp edges digging into her palm. William Ashford's office was a monument to wealth, a sterile landscape of polished mahogany and chrome. The city sprawled beneath the panoramic window, a tapestry of muted grays and greens, utterly indifferent to the seismic shift in her own world. She hadn't slept properly in days, the diner's greasy smells clinging to her even after countless showers, the image of his hand, his birthmark, a phantom limb superimposed on her own. Why hadn't her mother told her? Why this elaborate, cruel game of absence and sudden revelation? The air in the office was thick with unspoken words, heavy with the weight of years gone by. He sat behind his desk, a fortress of dark wood, his posture rigid, his face an impassive mask. The silence stretched, each tick of the ornate grandfather clock in the corner a hammer blow against her resolve. He looked older, she thought, the lines etched deeper around his eyes, the weight of the world settling onto his shoulders. Or perhaps it was just the weight of her, This unexpected daughter, this ghost from a past he had likely buried deep. I brought this back. Her voice was rougher than she intended, laced with a bitterness she hadn't realized she possessed. The envelope landed on the polished surface of his desk with a soft thud. He didn't reach for it. His gaze locked on hers, an unsettling mixture of scrutiny and something else regret. I don't want your money. Her breath hitched. The words hung in the air, charged with the unspoken accusations, the lifetime of unanswered questions. William Ashford finally broke the silence. His voice was low, carefully measured. Naomi, he started, then stopped, as if searching for the right words, the right tone, to bridge the chasm that separated them. I understand this is difficult. Difficult? The word felt like a cruel understatement, a dismissive wave of the hand at the gaping wound of her life. She scoffed, a harsh, brittle sound that echoed in the cavernous office. Difficult didn't even begin to cover it. Difficult was working double shifts at Mabel's, scrubbing burnt grease off the grill. Difficult was scraping together rent money. This was a hurricane tearing through the fragile structure of her existence, leaving behind wreckage she didn't know how to salvage. Difficult, she repeated, the word laced with venom. He flinched, almost imperceptibly. You think this is difficult? You abandon your child, let her grow up with nothing, with questions that eat her alive, and you think a check is going to fix it? Her hands trembled, her nails digging into her palms. She willed herself to stay calm, to maintain some semblance of control, but the anger, the raw, unfiltered hurt, was a tidal wave threatening to consume her. He sighed, a sound heavy with weariness. Your mother, she made her choices. She didn't want my help. His words were a defense, a justification, but they rang hollow in the opulent silence of his office. This space, this life he had built, was a testament to his power, his influence. What choice did her mother really have? A young woman, alone, struggling. What chance did she stand against a man like him? Naomi wanted to scream, to unleash the torrent of fury building within her, but she held back, her jaw clenched tight. Choices? Naomi laughed, a hollow, mirthless sound. She was barely an adult. Alone. Pregnant. What choices did she have? You think she wanted to work her fingers to the bone just to keep a roof over our heads? You think she wanted to see the worry in my eyes every time the bills piled up? The questions hung in the air, unanswered, unanswerable. William shifted in his chair, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond her shoulder. I didn't know. The words were barely a whisper, lost in the vastness of the room. Didn't know? Naomi stepped closer, the expensive Persian rug soft beneath her worn shoes. I didn't want to know. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a vulnerability she hadn't expected. It made her hesitate, a momentary crack in the armor of her anger. He looked away, his jaw clenched, the muscles in his neck taut. He rubbed his hand across his face, the familiar birthmark, her birthmark stark against his pale skin. I made mistakes, Naomi. Terrible mistakes. He met her gaze, his eyes filled with a weariness that went beyond the lines etched on his face. It was the weariness of a man carrying a burden he hadn't realized he'd been shouldering for so long. Mistakes. The word tasted like ash in her mouth. You don't get to throw money at me and call a mistake. You don't get to waltz back into my life after all these years and think you could buy me off. He flinched again, as if her words were physical blows. He opened his mouth to speak, but she cut him off. I didn't ask for this. I never asked to know your name. I never asked to know who my father was. Her voice cracked, the carefully constructed wall of anger crumbling around her. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. He finally reached for the envelope, his fingers tracing the edges. I wanted to help. Help. The word was laced with disbelief. You want to help? Then leave me alone. Go back to your life. Pretend I don't exist. That's the best help you can give me. She turned to leave, the weight of the unspoken words pressing down on her, suffocating her. The plush carpet swallowed the sound of her retreating footsteps, leaving only the silence, the heavy, oppressive silence of a past that refused to stay buried. As she reached the door, she heard his voice, low and hesitant. The DNA test, it came back positive. She paused, her hand on the cool metal of the doorknob. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She knew. She had known from the moment she saw his hand. That mark, that undeniable connection. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the city outside. Then, without looking back, she opened the door and stepped out into the blinding sunlight. The invitation arrived on cheap, flimsy paper, an almost insulting contrast to the embossed lettering proclaiming the grand opening of the Ashford Community Center. Naomi almost tossed it with the junk mail, the Shreveport sun glinting off the glossy finish, catching her eye one last time. Her fingers traced the elegant script, an invitation addressed specifically to her. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. What possible business could William Ashford, real estate magnate and her father, have with her now? Weeks had crawled by since that surreal confrontation at Mabel's kitchen. Weeks filled with the gnawing uncertainty of waiting for the DNA results, followed by the crushing confirmation that had upended her world. She'd agreed to the test, a small vial of blood, surrendering the secrets she'd carried her entire life. Secrets she believed were buried with the man she'd known only as Dad. The results had arrived in a sterile envelope, a clinical confirmation of a connection that felt anything but. A part of her, a small, wounded part, had hoped for some grand gesture, some sweeping declaration of paternal love. But William Ashford wasn't a man of sweeping gestures, or so it seemed. A single phone call, his voice clipped and formal, acknowledging the results. A brief, awkward silence before he'd offered a perfunctory, "Perhaps we should meet." She declined. What was there to say? What could a lifetime of absence possibly explain? Now this, an invitation, a public spectacle. Her stomach churned. She imagined the flash of cameras, the polite applause, the veiled curiosity in the eyes of Shreveport's elite. A showcase. Was this his way of making amends? Of announcing his newfound daughter? The thought left a sour taste in her mouth. Chef Reggie, her rock amidst the emotional turmoil, had simply squeezed her shoulder. "Go, Naomi. See what he's got to say." His words, gruff but laced with concern, were the push she needed. The day of the dedication ceremony arrived, heavy and humid. Naomi chose a simple dress, a defiant act against the unspoken expectation of dressing to impress. As she approached the imposing structure of the community center, a knot tightened in her chest. It was a beautiful building, all sleek lines and expansive windows, a stark contrast to the dilapidated community center a few blocks over. This one screamed wealth, influence, a testament to Ashford's power, and guilt. The crowd buzzed with anticipation. Local dignitaries, business leaders, and reporters mingled, their voices a low hum against the backdrop of classical music. Naomi felt out of place, her simple dress a stark contrast to the designer suits and cocktail dresses surrounding her. She spotted William near the podium, his silver hair gleaming under the spotlights. He looked smaller than she remembered, the weight of his age more pronounced. He hadn't seen her yet, his attention fixed on the prepared remarks in his hand. Mason, his younger associate, paced nearby, radiating impatience. He caught Naomi's eye, and a flicker of annoyance crossed his face. He clearly hadn't expected her to attend. Jeff, the older colleague, offered a curt nod, his expression carefully neutral. Naomi hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Was she doing the right thing? Could she face him, this man who was both stranger and father? She took a deep breath, the humid air thick in her lungs. She had to. She owed it to herself, to the memory of the man she'd called Dad, to understand why William Ashford had been absent for her entire life. She approached the podium just as William was being introduced. The crowd hushed. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers, a flicker of surprise, then something akin to apprehension. His prepared speech seemed to evaporate from his mind. He faltered, his gaze locked on hers. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. "This building," he finally said, his voice rougher than she remembered, "this building is named for the woman who taught me what strength really looks like." His words hung in the air, stunning the crowd into silence. Naomi's heart pounded in her chest. What was he doing? This public declaration, this unexpected tribute? Confusion warred with a nascent flicker off something else. Hope. Naomi Ellis. William continued, his voice gaining strength, his gaze never leaving hers. My daughter. The murmur rippled through the crowd, a wave of whispers and startled gasps. Mason looked as if he'd swallowed a lemon. Jeff, ever the pragmatist, merely adjusted his glasses. Naomi felt a dizzying rush of emotions. Anger, confusion, bewilderment, and a strange, unsettling sense of validation. He wasn't trying to buy her off with a building. He was acknowledging her publicly, unequivocally. This wasn't a calculated PR move. This was something else entirely. Something raw, something real. The ceremony concluded in a blur. The ribbon was cut, photos were taken, and polite congratulations were offered. But Naomi remained rooted to the spot, watching William as he navigated the crowd, a strange mixture of weariness and determination on his face. He was fighting his own battles, his own demons. And perhaps, just perhaps, she was part of his redemption. He approached her finally, the crowd thinning around them. Naomi, he began, his voice low. I know this doesn't make up for anything. She cut him off. It doesn't. Her voice was firm, but devoid of the bitterness she'd felt just moments before. He nodded, his gaze steady. I understand, but it's a start. I want to know you, Naomi. I want to explain. She looked at him, really looked at him, seeing past the wealth and power to the man beneath, a man wrestling with his past, a man who, despite his flaws, had just named a community center after his newly discovered daughter. A small, hesitant smile touched her lips. Then explain. The fluorescent lights of the community center office hummed, a sterile counterpoint to the lingering echoes of applause from the dedication ceremony. Naomi sat across from William, the stark functionality of the metal desk between them a tangible barrier. She picked at a loose thread on her worn jeans, the silence amplifying the frantic rhythm of her pulse. The man who might be her father, the thought still felt surreal, a fragile bubble threatening to burst with the slightest touch. He'd insisted on speaking to her privately, away from the press and the curious eyes of Shreveport's elite. His earlier composed facade had crumbled, revealing glimpses of vulnerability that both unsettled and intrigued her. William watched her, his gaze heavy with an emotion she couldn't decipher. Regret? Uncertainty? Or was it the same guardedness she felt hardening within her own chest? He cleared his throat, the sound breaking the strained silence. I wanted to apologize for the way I reacted earlier, he began, his voice rougher than she remembered. Each word seemed weighed down by unspoken years. Naomi's internal monologue word. An apology? Was that all he could offer? After years of absence, after a lifetime of unanswered questions, a simple apology felt insufficient. Yet a part of her, a small, desperate part, clung to the sliver of hope it represented. It was a shock, she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his eyes fixed on the worn surface of the desk. I understand. It was unexpected. For both of us. Unexpected. The word echoed the hollowness she felt. He'd built an empire, a life of privilege, while she'd scraped by, haunted by the ghost of a father she never knew. The unfairness of it all tightened her throat, threatening to choke her. The birthmark, she said, the words escaping before she could stop them. She needed to know, needed to hear him confirm the truth she already felt in her bones. He looked up, meeting her gaze directly for the first time. The intensity of his eyes, the same shade of hazel as her own, made her breath catch. It was your mother's idea, he said, his voice low and tinged with a pain that mirrored her own. The matching birthmarks. A way to identify you, if the need ever arose. A wave of dizziness washed over her. He'd known. He'd always known about her. And did it, she asked, her voice trembling. Did the need ever arise before today? He shifted in his chair, the movement betraying his unease. I made inquiries. Discreetly. I knew you were being cared for, that you were safe. The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Safe. but not loved, not wanted. Naomi felt a cold, not forming in her stomach. Safe. The word felt like a betrayal. Safe? She repeated, the bitterness seeping into her tone. While I struggled, while I wondered who my father was, her voice cracked, the dam of her emotions threatening to break. He reached across the desk, his hand hovering hesitantly above hers. For a moment, she considered pulling away, rejecting his belated attempt at connection. But something held her back. A flicker of hope, perhaps, or maybe just a morbid curiosity to see how far he would go. Naomi, he said, his voice softer now, laced with a plea she hadn't expected. I made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but I want to make things right. I want to make things right, she scoffed, pulling her hand away. How can you possibly make things right? You can't give me back the years I lost. You can't erase the anger choked her, leaving her breathless. He lowered his hand, his expression a mixture of resignation and pain. I know I can't, but I can help you now. Financially, with your education, anything you need. The offer, so casually delivered, felt like a slap in the face. Was this how he thought he could atone for his absence? With money? I don't want your money, she spat, the words laced with venom. I don't want anything from you. He flinched as if she'd struck him. The momentary vulnerability she'd glimpsed earlier vanished, replaced by a familiar mask of composure. I understand, he said, his voice stiff. He stood up, his movements abrupt. I didn't do it for you, he added, his voice barely above a whisper. I did it because it was the right thing to do. The words hung in the air, a stark confession that resonated with a truth that transcended their complicated situation. He hadn't done it for her. He'd done it for himself, to ease his own conscience. The realization hit Naomi with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't about her. It had never been about her. And yet a strange sense of relief washed over her. The truth, however painful, was finally out in the open. She watched him walk towards the door, his shoulders slumped, his gait heavy with the weight of unspoken years. He paused at the threshold, his hand resting on the doorknob. The DNA results will be back in a few days, he said, without turning around. I'll have my lawyer contact you. And then he was gone, leaving Naomi alone in the sterile silence of the community center office, the hum of the fluorescent lights a constant reminder of the unsettling reality that had just unfolded. The future stretched before her, uncertain and daunting, yet somehow, strangely, less burdened by the ghosts of the past. The truth, like a sharp knife, had cut through the years of uncertainty, leaving a raw, open wound. But it was a wound that could finally begin to heal. The greasy scent of frying bacon hung heavy in the air, a familiar perfume of Mabel's kitchen. Naomi wiped down the counter, the rhythmic squeak of the cloth a counterpoint to the sizzle of the grill. Weeks had blurred into a strange new reality, a reality where the man who'd walked into Mabel's for a late breakfast was now a recurring presence in her life. A presence she still struggled to define. You talking to your rich daddy again? Reggie's voice, gruff but laced with a hint of amusement, broke through Naomi's thoughts. He flipped a pancake with practiced ease, the spatula a familiar extension of his hand. Naomi felt a flicker of annoyance. Rich daddy. The phrase felt both absurd and unsettlingly accurate. He has a name, Reggie. She kept her gaze fixed on the counter, the swirling patterns in the laminate suddenly fascinating. Yeah, and their name is probably on half the buildings downtown. Reggie's chuckle rumbled through the small kitchen. He slid the pancake onto a plate, a golden disc against the chipped porcelain. So what's the bigwig want now? Another side of scrambled eggs with a caviar garnish. Naomi finally looked up, a wry smile tugging at the corner of her lips. Surprisingly, no. Just trying to get to know me, I guess. The words felt strange, foreign even. For years, the void left by her father had been a constant ache, a dull throb in the background of her life. Now, this tentative probing, this awkward dance of rediscovery, filled that space with a confusing mixture of hope and apprehension. He is, isn't he? Reggie's tone softened, the teasing replaced by a surprising gentleness. He leaned against the counter, his gaze thoughtful. Just don't let him forget who you are, Naomi. His words resonated deep within her, a quiet echo of her own anxieties. Who was she in this new equation? The struggling waitress? The long-lost daughter? A pawn in some elaborate game she didn't yet understand? The questions swirled in her mind, a disorienting vortex of possibilities. I won't, she murmured, more to herself than to Reggie. The certainty in her voice was a fragile shield against the uncertainty that gnawed at her. She picked up a clean coffee cup, the smooth ceramic a comforting weight in her hand. He called last night. Wants to take me to dinner. A proper dinner. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. Dinner with William Ashford. Not at Mabel's, surrounded by the familiar clatter of plates and the comforting aroma of greasy spoon fare. But somewhere else. Somewhere elegant, intimidating, and alien. Fancy, Reggie drawled, a knowing glint in his eyes. Just remember, those fancy places serve the same stuff we do, just with smaller portions and bigger prices. Don't let them intimidate you, girl. Naomi managed a weak smile. Intimidated didn't even begin to describe the swirling mix of emotions that churned within her. She was terrified, yes, of the unknown, of the potential for rejection, of the possibility that this fragile connection, this tentative bridge across the chasm of years, would crumble beneath the weight of expectation. But beneath the fear, a flicker of something else burned. A stubborn ember of hope, a desperate yearning for connection, for belonging. Later that evening, after the last diner had left and the clatter of the day had subsided, Naomi found herself standing outside Mabel's. The cool night air a welcome balm against the lingering heat of the kitchen. The streetlights cast long, distorted shadows, transforming the familiar street into something strange and unfamiliar. Just like her life. William's car, a sleek, black sedan that seemed to absorb the surrounding darkness, pulled up to the curb. The tinted windows obscured the interior, adding another layer of mystery to the already enigmatic man. He stepped out of the car, a figure of quiet power in a tailored suit. Even in the dim light, the lines of weariness etched around his eyes were visible. He looked older, somehow, more vulnerable. The realization sent a pang of unexpected sympathy through Naomi. Naomi, he greeted her, his voice low and steady. His gaze held hers, and for a moment, she felt a flicker of connection, a fleeting sense of recognition that transcended the awkwardness of their newfound relationship. William, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The formality felt strange, a barrier between them. The drive to the restaurant was filled with a strained silence, punctuated by the hum of the engine and the occasional distant siren. Naomi stole glances at William, trying to decipher the emotions that flickered across his face. He seemed lost in thought, his gaze fixed on the passing cityscape. She wondered what he was thinking, what ghosts of the past haunted him. The restaurant was everything she'd expected and more. Crystal chandeliers glittered overhead, casting a warm glow on the polished mahogany tables. The hushed murmur of conversation, the clinking of silverware, the discreet movements of the waitstaff, it was a world away from the boisterous energy of Mabel's. As they ate, William spoke of his life, his work, his ambitions. He spoke of his late wife, his voice tinged with a sadness that resonated with Naomi. He spoke of the regret that gnawed at him, the regret of missed opportunities, of roads not taken. He didn't speak of her, not directly, but in the silences, in the hesitant glances, in the unspoken questions that hung in the air, Naomi felt his unspoken acknowledgement of their shared history. He offered her a life she'd never imagined, a life of privilege and comfort, a life far removed from the struggles she'd always known. He offered her a family, a connection to a past she'd only glimpsed through faded photographs and fragmented memories. But beneath the surface of his offer, beneath the veneer of paternal concern, Naomi sensed a deeper need, a desperate yearning for absolution. As the evening drew to a close, William reached across the table, his hand covering hers. His touch was hesitant, almost tentative. "I know this is a lot to take in," he said, his voice low and earnest. "I don't expect you to forgive me. Not yet. But I hope we can build something real, Naomi. A real relationship. Naomi looked at him, her heart a turbulent mix of conflicting emotions. Could she forgive him? Could she embrace this new reality, this unexpected twist in the narrative of her life? She didn't know. But in that moment, looking into the eyes of the man who was both stranger and father, she saw a flicker of hope, a fragile ember burning in the darkness. The journey ahead would be long and arduous, fraught with uncertainty and shadowed by the ghosts of the past. But as she clasped William's hand, a silent promise passed between them, a promise to face the future together.